Okay. See many familiar faces. Nice to see all of you. Some haven't seen for a few years. Wow. Yeah, interesting. A lot more folks showed up for this talk than the last. Last talk's topic was where to start the study and practice of Buddhism. It's only a handful. Today we have quite a few more. I'm always curious at what brings everyone to a talk. Is the topic? Is it the time? I wonder, but we can get some
Just got
feedback
it an
later.
email today. Didn't know it was there yet.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you now. I don't have my headphones on, but you could save your comments for later. We'll have some time to engage. For now, if everyone could just mute your sound, this way we don't have any feedback or things like that. And then for texting, thank you for sharing your idea. But during the talk, we'll refrain from texting. We'll turn the texting option off. This way we can first focus on listening and just absorbing some information I have to share, some experiences. And then at the end of the talk, we'll have some time for either Q&A or just discussion, sharing. Okay. So for today's talk, the title is what does this have to do with me? I don't know if that caught your attention, but why did I give this title to this talk? The content has to do with what's considered by some people as the final teachings of the Buddha. Maybe not everyone will agree that these are the final teachings, but this discourse given by the Buddha was recorded and passed on especially in the Mahayana tradition, as sometimes it's called the final teachings of the Buddha. Some translations, it's the Buddha's bequeathed teachings. There's a couple of other translations, but it's a very brief discourse which summarizes the basic principles of the Buddhist path, basic principles of Buddha Dharma, which don't depart from precepts, samadhi, and wisdom. Another way to put that is ethical living, mental stability, and insight into our human nature, into our human capacity to either suffer or to be free, psychologically free from psychological ailments and distress. We call it freedom or liberation. What does it have to do with me? I chose that because this teaching was supposedly given directly to the monastics, those people who followed the Buddha closely. And monastics, another way to say nuns or monks, clerics, people who left the home life, people who left the family life, their jobs, the home life, to pursue spiritual freedom or to pursue freedom of the mind. Supposedly, these last teachings were directed towards them. So if we look at the sutra or the discourse from that angle, the teachings may be seen as specific to monastics and monastic life, especially monastic discipline or daily ethical living. So it may seem at first read that it doesn't apply at all to us, what we call lay people, or just ordinary folks who live ordinary lives, who have a home, who have a family. We have our own careers compared to monastics who just, well, they may have a home, but they don't own anything personally, give up a lot of possessions to be free from the burdens that come along with some, not necessarily possessions, but possessiveness. I don't know what your experience is, but sometimes it may be easier, or we may be more likely to have a possessive mind, a mind that clings to things that we have when we have more, when we claim ownership, right? So my house, my job, my partner, my family, all these different things that we claim ownership to. We may cling very strongly to them. We don't want to lose them. We don't want to lose our family, lose our job, lose our house, or lose all of our earnings or savings or possessions, things we worked hard for, things that sometimes bring us a lot of joy, or things that we think will bring us joy, and so we cling tightly. It's possible that the more we have, the more we may tend to cling and try to possess, and then fear losing it. And we may end up living our life fearing loss and just craving gains, always wanting to gain more, fear of losing something. But it's not necessarily the case. If that were the case, then, why would any layperson practice Buddhism? If having stuff equals suffering, then, for the layperson, there's no chance of freedom. But that's not the case. Having things doesn't equal suffering. So if we look at this discourse of the Buddha from the perspective of just the principles of Buddha Dharma, learning how not to crave, learning how not to fear loss or crave gain, we can still have possessions, we can still have things or conventionally claim ownership and suffer less, potentially not suffer. So I'd like to just introduce the sutra, introduce this discourse tonight, kind of a general introduction, focusing on the spirit of the teachings as it applies not only to monastics, but to laypersons, to everyone. The Buddha's teaching applies to everyone, but in different contexts, there are different specific practices. So today will be this kind of general review and introduction to the discourse. I won't go line by line, talking about every line, what it means. I won't get into the historical background, where it came from, who translated it. You can find all that stuff on Wikipedia or whatever, whatever Buddhist resource you have. I'd like to focus just more on the content and how does it really apply to our lives? What does it really have to do with us? Okay. Maybe when there's a chance, I may refer to a line or two from the actual discourse, but it won't be line by line. So just the background, the general context of this teaching. It's considered the Buddha's final teaching. And it was when he was ill, just before he was passing away. I believe it was, as the story goes, in the woods, in the forest, between two trees, lying comfortably, surrounded by the closest monastic disciples. the closest ones, meaning, the 10 or so or 20 who were practiced very closely with the Buddha and who also became teachers and guides for the whole community as well as for lay people. But they may have been a few hundred, even a few hundred people gathered together to hear, the final teaching. Their teacher, their revered, cherished, loved teacher was about to pass away. You can kind of just think of that atmosphere. Even just reflecting on that atmosphere, we may be able to cherish what we hear or what we read when we do pick up this discourse. Although we don't live in the time of the Buddha, I always find it's amazing that we have access to all of these teachings and literature, right? We press a button and it's there. We press a video and it turns on a Dharma talk. So we may take it for granted because it's just, there's so much of Buddha Dharma available. But if we can just have this mindset of it's actually still quite precious that we have the opportunity to contact it. Even after the Buddha passed, his disciples tried their best to remember it and passed it on. So one thing, before getting into the content, I think it's also helpful to reflect on the fact that this material that's passed on to us, it's not perfect. The Buddhist tradition transmitted the teachings orally for many years. As things get passed on over the years, the content changes, it may get edited, things may be omitted, things may be added. And that's all okay, as long as we understand what the main principles of the Buddha's teachings are. And with this discourse, it presents these main principles in a way that if we can grasp it, if we can understand it and practice it, any other Buddhist teaching that we encounter will know what is the spirit of it, what is the main essence of it, what is the Buddha really trying to say? How is he trying to help us to see for ourselves, experience for ourselves a life that is relieved from suffering, or at least reducing our suffering? What is he saying? What is the main point? If we approach a discourse like this, if we approach a teaching with this mindset, we look for the principles, we don't get too picky with the details, then we won't get lost or confused. And we try to not only understand, but we can apply it and experience it for ourselves. That's what the Buddha wanted us to do. His purpose was not just to have people believe and be believers or worshipers, but he gave some tools for us to use for ourselves to experience it, experience freedom of mind. So if we look at any Buddhist teaching, the principle, again, the main essence of it, precepts, samadhi, wisdom. Those three are key. The Eightfold Noble Path is another way to talk about that, but sometimes it may be more difficult to remember 8 things. So we can remember 3 things, right? Precept, samadhi, wisdom. Or if a different formula works, ethics, stability, and insight. So with this in mind, let's look at some more of the content. So within this teaching, the Buddha starts talking about precepts or ethical living. How to live, how to behave in a way that reduces suffering. How to live in a way that doesn't feed craving. Precepts especially focus on not feeding our tendency to crave. Many precepts are simply saying, don't do this, don't do that, right? It's just pointing out what behaviors often lead to craving, often lead to becoming entangled in different affairs and pulling us away from the path of freedom and actually behaviors that create more bondage, that cause problems for us. When I myself look at precepts or just any of the Buddha's teaching, I often feel humble because I'm here teaching about it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm practicing it perfectly. Whenever I read it, I reflect on myself and say, wow, I could do that much better. I need to work on this part. So as I talk about these things, it's really for myself, helping me to reflect. And so that's what the Buddha said in this discourse, that the precepts are our teacher. He said, if you want to practice anything, at least practice the precepts. These basic guidelines for how to live are our teacher. So he said, when I'm not around, don't worry about it. If you have the precepts, you're all set. You're all good. Just follow the precepts. Everything else will fall into place if we can practice the most basic foundation, how to live, how to behave in a way that doesn't feed craving. So he doesn't spell out all the precepts in this discourse. For lay people, the Buddhist 5 precepts are, fairly simple: not killing, not stealing, not having sexual relations. It's called sexual misconduct that create problems, not lying, and not taking intoxicants. Those are the 5 basic ways of behaving that can reduce a lot of problems, especially craving. For monastics, there are hundreds. If any of you have done research, monastic precepts are in the hundreds. They're different for monks and nuns, based on different needs or conditions of males or females at that time of society. And even beyond just the monastic precepts, there are also what's called deportment, guidelines for deportment, or how to conduct oneself, how to stand, how to walk, how to sit, how to move, how to eat. In the Chan tradition, which I study in, there are Chan Master Bai Zhang has a whole collection of guidelines for monastics in monasteries for very, very fine and detailed ways of how to live, how to behave. Sometimes it seems very almost obsessive or even compulsive, some of the guidelines, very fine details of how to sit or how to walk. And for example, monastics shouldn't walk with their hands, clasped behind their back and kind of just strolling and looking left and right. That's a rule. And at first you may think, geez, you can't walk like that. What's the problem? For example, it's not just about a rule, following a rule, but if we walk with a certain posture, especially looking left and right, kind of bobbing left and right as we walk, what's the quality of the state of our body and mind? How aware are we of walking at that moment? We're looking here, looking there, scratching, hands here, hands there, fidgeting. What are we aware of? Are we aware of our behavior? It's possible that we're not. It's possible that we're just habitually moving. So in this case, rules of deportment, or how to stand or walk, it's to help facilitate mindfulness. The guidelines, the rules of the precepts facilitate or develop mindfulness, awareness of what are we doing at this moment. If we walk with awareness, what does that look like? Would we have any need to kind of just look left, look right, look here, look there? If we're aware of our body and we're relaxed, what would that posture be like? What are our eyes doing? Interestingly, if we are relaxed and fully aware of our body as we walk, our gaze is probably going to be where we're walking. We're looking at where we're walking because that's what we're doing. Yeah, if we need to cross the street, we have to look left, we have to look right. Doesn't mean we shouldn't look when we cross the street. That's for safety. It's because we're crossing the street. When we walk mindfully, actually our deportment, our posture becomes very similar, if not identical, to the precept, the guideline. So these rules of Buddhist monastic behavior actually can be practiced by lay practitioners, many of them, because we can be mindful of walking all the time. And we can try to have good posture, good deportment for the sake of mindfulness, for the sake of cultivating freedom. So in the beginning of this discourse, the Buddha really emphasizes precepts and following them, just as they're a wonderful teacher. They can be our teacher for eventually freeing ourselves from suffering and living a fulfilling, peaceful life. I don't know if it's worth going into what does he exactly say about precepts, but for example, why do some of these things seem to have nothing to do with us? He's talking to monastics, and so, for example, when he talks about precepts, just to give a couple of examples, you should not get involved in buying, selling, bartering. You shouldn't have any real estate. You shouldn't have any animals. You shouldn't have any property or wealth. Okay, right there, that doesn't work for most, if not all of us, right? We need jobs. We need to make investments. We have pets. If we're farmers, we may have animals. We need to have property and wealth in order to survive. However, we can look at the spirit behind this teaching. For monastics, they don't need those things. Why? Because their focus is on the practice, living in poverty, and they're provided for by laypersons. Their food, their clothing, even the buildings are often built by the lay people of that time. So the focus of the monastics was not on these things. But as lay people, we can have these things. We can engage in business, have property, get involved in these things. However, we can practice not becoming consumed by them. We can practice not having this possessive mindset that fears losing them, that's always wanting to gain more. And even thinking that we're not going to be happy unless we have more. I was speaking to one of my clients today, and we were just reflecting on how it's so easy to think that we'll be happy in the future once we have enough. For example, maybe we don't have enough money right now. So we think, well, I can't be happy now because I just really don't have enough money. Once I have this much money, once I have this much savings, then I'll be happy. And once we get there, maybe it's not enough. It's like, yeah, this is pretty good. It's pretty comfortable. But if I just had more, if I had some more money, some more savings, if I had some investments, actually, yeah, let me invest in something. Let me invest in stocks. Once I have some stocks, I have this passive income. then I will be happy. Then I'll be at peace and I can retire and survive off of, this passive income. I don't know, you can reflect about your own situation. Does that happen sometimes where the more we have, the more we want, and the more we think that we won't be happy until a certain point in the future? And that if we lose these things, then we'll lose our happiness. So the Buddha's speaking to monastics here. They don't need any of this, so they don't need to focus on it. For lay persons, we can have them. We can engage in work. We can make investments. We can be as rich as the richest person in the world. And we can still be free if we can train ourselves to let go of possessiveness, to let go of craving for these things. So, after talking about these basic precepts or the principles behind them, the Buddha said that the most important thing for a practitioner is to be mindful, to have a steadfast mind, or this right mindfulness, attentiveness and awareness of oneself, and this direction of understanding and experiencing our suffering and learning how to transform it. This is the purpose of practice. So he points out we want to be careful not to be led astray by all these activities we have to engage in to survive, to lead a stable life. Okay, so the purpose of precepts, avoiding craving. And we also avoid anger if we avoid craving. If we don't crave or possess things so much, then if we lose them, if somebody steals them, or if we have to depart with them, if we lose our stocks, if we lose that big investment we just got into, we won't be so upset. If all that we worked hard for, our house, our possessions, maybe burn in a fire, we'll be upset, likely, but we may not be devastated if our focus is on living mindfully, if our focus is on liberating our mind. Then the comings and goings of these possessions and things that we have, it won't devastate us. It won't bother us so deeply. So the Buddha says here that with that kind of mindset, you won't hoard things, and you'll be content with what's enough. Be content with just having what's sufficient to survive and to continue to practice, to train the mind, liberate the mind. The Buddha also talks about it may seem as if you're reading the sutra, I don't know if you have it on hand, but when you read through it, it may seem like it jumps from topic to topic. But it's, again, he's very briefly going over his teachings as a whole. Another thing he points out, and this goes especially for people who are focused on training the mind and developing stability, and for some people developing this power of concentration in meditation, he warns us not to try to conceal our faults or try to pretend that we've gained something or show off some sort of spiritual attainment. So the first part, not concealing our faults. For some people, when they approach Buddhist practice and they get very into it or very serious about it, sometimes a person can get fixated on the forms, really attached to the sitting meditation, sitting for long hours, reading certain sutras, they may place so much importance on not only precepts, but the fact that they're really good at keeping precepts, and may think that now they're great practitioners because I keep the precepts. I meditate every day for hours. I recite the sutras. I understand everything. Sometimes this spiritual practice, or this practice of studying the Buddha Dharma, can turn into just feeding the ego or feeding self-centeredness. So actually, instead of reducing our self-centeredness and our sense of possessing now spiritual traits or possessing good qualities, being a good practitioner, we have this mind of craving. We're trying to accumulate and show off our spiritual attainment. We may sit for a couple of hours and feel like so excited we have to tell someone, hey, I just sat for like 3 hours. It was awesome. So calm. And oh, I felt like my body disappear. I saw the Buddha. I saw the image of the Buddha. This must mean something. I must be getting close. I think it was Chogyam Trungpa from the Tibetan tradition who mentioned the idea of spiritual materialism. A person can get so absorbed and obsessed with spiritual practice that it becomes possessing something. Instead of possessing material things, they may want to possess the spiritual, or possess states of mind, or try to possess or be honored by other people, respected by other people, or followed by other people. And what happens is that we may start to get so fixated on possessing spiritual things, we forget about the whole purpose of spiritual practice, which is to uncover our faults, our mistakes, our confusion, and to change, to not make those mistakes, to train ourselves to be on the path. So the Chinese way to describe the word practice is 修行, which means to fix one's behavior, to fix or to repair how we behave with our body, with our speech, with our mind. That's the purpose of the spiritual path. It's not about attaining something and showing it off. So this applies to monastics who are in positions of being teachers. It also applies to lay people in positions of being teachers. I mean, I guess people see me as a teacher. That's why I'm here tonight. So we have to be careful, even for those who are not teachers. They may think of themselves as great practitioners, and that's just feeding arrogance. It's creating more suffering and avoiding concealing faults. There are even people who claim to be what's called an arhat, a liberated person. During the Buddha's time, it seemed like just left and right, people were liberating themselves, and the Buddha would say, oh, this person is now free and that person is free from suffering. They've gone past it. They've no more to learn, no more to practice. They've realized enlightenment. After the Buddha passed, people didn't claim to be arhats usually. The ones who claimed to be liberated people were probably trying to sell themselves. During the Buddha's time, people also didn't walk around saying, hey, I'm also an arhat, I'm free, come follow me. The Buddha just pointed out an observation of this person's way of being is without suffering, it's without vexation. So nowadays, if we see people who claim to be liberated, it's often an advertisement. So we can also be careful of people who claim to possess some sort of spiritual power or ability. Why are they professing that? Why is there a need to profess one's attainment? It's often a problem. So we can be careful of that. And the Buddha is pointing that out here. Going further on in the talk, the Buddha says that by observing precepts, now another way we could look at this is by observing behavior that is mindful, we can attain all different levels of collectedness of mind or realize the ending of suffering. The principle is that by having a foundation of solid behavior, mindful behavior, it's much easier to then concentrate the mind. It doesn't mean that if we're just following the precepts, we're going to have this absorption of mind or deep concentration. It doesn't work like that. However, with the foundation of ethical behavior, it's much easier to concentrate and to develop mental stability, right? Because if we're doing things in our daily life that create problems for ourselves, that fill us with more craving, or that fill us with guilt or doubt, then when we sit down to concentrate, what is our mind going to be filled with? Right? Our mind will be filled with regrets, doubts, fears. How can we concentrate if that's the foundation? So the foundation of practice is precepts. It's mindful behavior. That is the foundation for concentration, for deep absorption, or for just mental stability. If we have the foundation of that, then it's just much more natural and easy to have insight into our nature and to be freed from so much suffering. So the Buddha emphasizes again, the precepts are the foundation. And it's a big part of this discourse. So I spent a bit more time on it. The Buddha continues talking about controlling our senses, controlling or guarding our five senses, which is seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. It's basically our contact with the world. How to control our senses? Well, he just says in general, we need to restrain these senses, or actually restrain from, again, craving the things that we contact when we see things, when we hear things. It's very easy to crave when we see something that's beautiful or hear something that's pleasant, right? Feel something that's comfortable. The pleasant feelings, the pleasant sensations that we have in our life, it's very easy to crave them, because who doesn't want to feel something good? Who wouldn't want it to continue? But the Buddha points out that with all things that are pleasant that we contact through our senses, if we're not careful, our desires will just overwhelm us. As it says here, a person's desires would become uncontrollable, kind of like a wild horse. And a wild, uncontrolled horse, he said, it could drag someone into a pit. It's a very vivid description of what desire can do to us. And maybe you can reflect on yourselves, or ourselves. Have we been in a situation that because of desire, it kind of dragged us into a situation which we didn't really want to get into, but we ended up there? It's like, how did this happen? How did I get here? We may ask ourselves, how did I get here? What am I doing? And it may often be that it starts with a little bit of desire, starts with a pattern of craving that we're like, hey, no big deal. But it may end up turning into a storm, uncontrollable craving. The Buddha said in that case, this is how so many calamities happen. Because our senses, we can also say our mind, is drawn or driven by our senses, what's pleasant and what's unpleasant, and how we're driven to get more things that feel good, and how we're so so often avoiding things that are unpleasant. So he said we have to guard our senses, kind of like we have these thieves, uh, thieves that we don't want to let go of their restraints. Can't let the thieves out of the prison. It's just again a very vivid way of helping us be attentive to how we even use our eyes and our ears and our bodies. If we're more aware of how we use our eyes and ears and bodies, we'll have better access to our mind on the more internal level. What are we thinking? So the next part of the discourse, the Buddha talks about the mind being the source of how our senses or how our body is acting. So it may be easier to be aware of our body, what we're doing with it. It may not be so easy to be aware of what are we thinking and what are the even more subconscious patterns of thought or craving that are there. But once we guard our senses, it's much easier to have access or to be aware of our internal, we could say our internal sense of mind, of thinking, remembering, having intentions. So it's kind of like in sitting meditation, we often sit still, right? We often close our eyes. We have this posture that's just unmoving. We could say our senses at that time are controlled. We're not looking here and there. We're not listening to this and that. We're not moving here and there. Our senses are calmed. When our senses are calmed and contained through sitting meditation, then it becomes so much easier to be aware of, oh, wow, what am I thinking about? We become much more keenly aware of thought, emotion, and the drive that's internally going. So the Buddha then talks about seeing the mind clearly and restraining the mind is the key to restraining our bodies or our five senses, so to speak. And here there's the example of the mind is like a wild monkey. Have you heard that explanation before, or that analogy? The mind, or our thinking and our attention, it's like a monkey jumping from branch to branch. First, we're looking at something, then we're listening to something, then we're paying attention to our body, we're moving, we're scratching, we're smelling, we're thinking, and we have all these reactions to everything. Our kind of everyday state of mind is often chaotic. We may not notice it until we stop, until we actually just stop. We sit, we stop, and we observe. So with Buddhist meditation, the two aspects that are prominent with Buddhist meditation can be called stopping and seeing. Chinese is zhi and guan, or shamatha and vipassana. Stopping and seeing. If we just stop, if we just sit, or if we just stand, we can observe what is our mind doing? How is it either creating suffering or not? Is it out of control, leading our body to be out of control, or is it well contained and stable? So the Buddha points out that at the core of the practice, after behavior and precepts, it's training the mind, restraining the mind, and developing awareness of what our mind and body are doing from moment to moment. Later on, the Buddha talks about just being moderate in terms of food. So for monastics, food is looked at as medicine. And in many traditions, there are fixed times where you can eat. You eat when either you go out and you beg for food, or at a monastery in the Chan tradition, you eat when food is served. There's may not be a pantry you can just go to and grab snacks when you want, or a fridge you could just go to. Some places have a snack room if it's needed, but the so-called proper periods of eating in the monastic context refer to, well, when food is served, or when people give you food. The Buddha talked about not hoarding food and hiding it and just, trying to find comfort in eating. Although this doesn't apply exactly to us, our rules of mealtime may not be so strict as monastics. But doesn't it also apply? How do we approach food? How do we relate to food? Do we have a routine that is based on, well, we eat when we're hungry, we eat because we need the nutrition at certain times? Or do we just find ourselves kind of reflexively grabbing for snacks, grabbing for food, and trying to eat food that just makes us feel good when we're not happy? The Buddha pointed out that the way we relate to food can also either damage our mind or be healthy or develop stability. So damage our mind, meaning if we just go for food whenever we want, we're just feeding craving. Our body may even be very well fed, but we're often feeding craving, the process of craving. And what's interesting is that, I don't know about your experience, that if we let ourselves just go for food when we crave it, we may find that in other situations, in other contexts, we may just go for something because we want it. May not be food, could be sex, could be money, could be something else. But if that energy of craving, if we just let it go and just act on it, grabbing snacks, we may find out we're trying to grab other things and possess them because we just want them. We want to be satiated. We want to feel good. So the Buddha talks a lot about, restraining or having discipline towards food and eating in the proper way, eating to sustain our health, but being careful not to crave. This can be very beneficial to cultivating stability of mind. If we're not thinking about food, if we're not thinking about filling our mouths and our bellies, it relieves a lot of burden on the mind and relieves that mechanism of craving in a very powerful way. The Buddha then talks about sleep in a similar way. Maybe we crave sleep. For some of us, maybe we're like, well, food is not my thing. I don't care. I could go a whole day without eating. But sleep, maybe sleep is our thing. Maybe it's like we don't feel good. We don't know what to do with ourselves. So we just kind of lie down, rest, sleep. The Buddha warned that too much sleep is also damaging. Because for one, aren't we just wasting time? We may be avoiding something, so we sleep. We don't know what to do with our suffering, so we sleep. Some people who experience severe depression, they may sleep for many, many more hours than is needed, but they may just feel so sleepy because it's so painful to be with the suffering that they have. Sleep is an escape. So they may sleep 14, 18 hours a day. So sleeping can also be a way of escape. And the Buddha warned not to sleep too much, not to escape suffering, but not to waste time and make use of the time that we have to practice, to be mindful, to do the things that develop mental stability, freedom of mind, in addition to just doing what we have to do to survive. He talks here about even making use of the time in the middle of the night to recite sutras and meditate. This is interesting. I forget the exact terminology of how during the Buddha's time, the period of the day was divided, but basically they would sleep for a few hours. But in the early, you could say the early morning, or this is middle of the night for us, maybe 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., you could start meditating. So you just sleep from 10 to 2 and meditate. If you don't even need to sleep that much, then sleep less, meditate more, recite sutras more in the middle of the night. In some Buddhist traditions, the monastics, they don't lie down when they sleep. They just sit all night. Have you heard that? I tried that. For me, it was very painful, very uncomfortable. I ended up bouncing back and forth, falling over. My whole body just felt painful, and it was a terrible experience. Some people practice that in hopes to be diligent, to try to make use of all of the time that they have to meditate. Can't we just skip sleeping? But to look at that practically, we need sleep. Even monastics of the Buddha's time who didn't have busy lives like we have, they probably didn't need as much sleep. And for those of you who have attended intensive retreats where you're pretty much just sitting all day, or maybe doing some walking meditation, cleaning up the tables, doing a little bit of chores, that's pretty much the most effortful thing and stressful thing is, cleaning the table. So not much sleep is needed when we're leading a very restful and easygoing life like that. At least it doesn't require as much physical energy or mental energy. But for laypersons in modern times, we need to sleep. Probably we need 7, 8 hours, maybe more. But we can focus on getting enough sleep. How much sleep do we need to feel good, to feel healthy, to function well? How much sleep is too much? On weekends, we think, oh, finally I can sleep. Do we end up sleeping for hours and hours and say, well, maybe I'm going to be tired if I get up now, so let me just keep sleeping. Let me roll over and sleep another couple of hours. Do we need that? Or is it just this kind of craving for comfort of just lying there, losing awareness? How much we need it's a personal thing, but the Buddha is reminding us to be careful, not to sleep too much because of craving, and not to waste our time, not to waste time that we could use being wakeful, being mindful, and cultivating the practice. He uses another analogy that if we sleep and waste our time, how can we waste our time when our afflictions are like a poisonous snake asleep in our own hearts, in our own minds? All of this craving and anger and confusion, problematic mental, psychological patterns that we have, sometimes it seems like it's not there. It may just not be happening at the moment, but it's like there's a poisonous snake in our mind. All of our afflictions, it's like this poisonous snake. Our practice is actually to get the snake out of there, to be careful, to be mindful, and to remove the snake, so that when we encounter things, it won't jump out and bite us or bite other people. If we use our time to practice wakefully, mindfully, then when we encounter situations that are challenging, we'll be able to control ourselves. We'll be able to be more stable in the midst of the challenge. We'll be more at peace in the face of even physical pain, hardship. So the Buddha encourages us to practice wakefully, not to get lost in sleep. Later on, the Buddha talks about anger and ill will. So the first part, he's talking a lot about craving, being careful not to crave. Later on, it talks about anger and how anger is another kind of poison, or it's like a fire that can burn us. And he starts off with something very vivid and I think unforgettable, where he says, even if someone were to come and dismember you, even if someone were to come and dismember you, joint by joint, cutting your arms off, cutting your hands off, cutting your arms off, cutting your legs off, he says, why hate? Why hate them? Can't we include them in our heart? Can't we feel compassion towards them? At first it's like, how would we respond if someone started dismembering us joint by joint? Or how would we respond if someone just came up to us with a stick and just started slapping us one joint at a time, starting with the fingers, then the hands, then the arms, slaps us in the face? How would we respond? Would we respond with anger? It's pretty challenging. Or if not physical attack, but even verbal, right? But the Buddha is pointing out that, is anger necessary? Does anger help? Does anger benefit anything? Does it help you endure the attack by becoming angry? Does it help the other person to stop attacking when we are angry? And it's interesting because with anger, in some way, maybe we feel powerful. If we're angry, we may feel a kind of confidence or power rather than feeling afraid, right? When we're afraid, it's almost paralyzing and uncomfortable and just, very, very paralyzing. With anger, maybe we feel at least a confidence and some kind of control that we can try to stop something. So we use anger often to deal with attack of different sorts. But do we need it? Does it really benefit us? The Buddha points out that anger kind of destroys virtue. Anger destroys our peace. And whatever we may have accumulated by concentration and trying to reduce our craving, it can be damaged or destroyed by anger. Does it mean that we don't respond, or we just let people dismember us? We let people hit us, or let people hurt others, or let people disrespect or try to harm others? No, it doesn't mean we don't act, but it's just talking about anger. And that if we can cultivate patience or forbearance, this is the practice of, in the face of what's often unpleasant, like being attacked, in the face of that, we can cultivate mental stability. We can cultivate a unmoved mind, and we can even cultivate compassion. So he says a person who has this forbearance, who has a mind that's compassionate and stable, even in the face of harm, that person is we can say is a great person, virtuous person, strong person. Strength coming from endurance, a mind that's unshaken, or shaken less, at least. We can practice by not responding with anger and by using all the practices we discussed to maintain stability in the face of harm. briefly, just to talk about the last few parts, because we're getting close to the finish of the talk. The Buddha reminds the monastics to not be arrogant, and he says to rub your head. And the reason he says that is because the monastics in the Buddhist tradition all shave their heads. Hair at that time was often a symbol of status, a symbol of beauty. Today, it's often our hair is a kind of a thing we can use to beautify ourselves. So when the monastics shave the head, it's kind of symbolic of shaving the kind of ornaments of the body, or removing ornamentation of the body. For a layperson, well, we may not shave our heads, we may lose our hair, losing more day by day. But whether we have hair or not, what the Buddha is saying here is by rubbing the head. Again, if it was bald, the monastic realizes there's no more hair here. What do I have to be so proud about? What do I have to be so possessive about in terms of how I look? The Buddha said, well, since you've discarded this personal adornment and you're wearing rags, why be arrogant? Why be so caught up in appearance? For us as lay practitioners, if we could shave our head, it's convenient. Maybe not everyone wants to do it. I haven't shaved my head since coming back from monastic life. I have hair, brush my hair, make the hair look good. In many ways, this is a practical thing. If we show up to work with hair that looks like we just woke up, what's going to happen then? Maybe the boss will send us home. Having a well-groomed appearance, it's something normal for lay practitioners. But we can also practice not being so caught up in it. Yeah, we're tidy, we're well-groomed, but that's it. We don't need to obsess with it. The less we obsess with adorning ourselves, the less we obsess with our appearance, the more at ease our mind will be. Because even if we look good, and even if we really feel we look good, believe we look good, and we're often thinking, wow, I look good. Yeah, this new hairstyle really looks good. I look good. That arrogance is a burden. On the one hand, it may seem like confidence, and a person who believes they look good may feel they have more confidence. But if it turns into arrogance, it's a burden. And it will be worrying about how we look, fear of how people think of how we look. And that's a burden. The Buddha talks about flattery in a similar way. To summarize, because I don't think we have time to go over too much more of the detail, but the Buddha talks about the practices of, again, being content. Practicing being content with what we have. Whether we're a monastic with almost no possessions, or a modern monastic, which actually has much more possessions than those of the Buddha's time, or a layperson who has all kinds of possessions and things. Now, can we practice being content? Can we enjoy what we have, use what we have, and even help other people gain benefit by using what we have, using our wealth, using our talent, using our possessions? But we can practice being content with, hey, I don't need more. I can have more. I can have less. But I can be content with what I have. The basic premise of Buddhist insight is that we don't need to have something more to be happy. And if we have less, it doesn't mean we're unhappy. We have the potential to be content and to be free from craving, free from anger, free from possessiveness. We all have that potential. In the Chan tradition, that potential is described as being, it's sudden. We could suddenly realize contentment. It's often called sudden enlightenment, but we can also call it sudden contentment. The mind is no longer craving, no longer avoiding, no longer clinging and constantly thinking about what's next. Sudden contentment is possible. Does it mean sudden and forever content? Probably not. But the moment we practice being content, and the Buddha is encouraging us to practice contentment, the moment we practice it by just letting go of craving and being fully aware of here, what we have now at this moment, not thinking about it, not thinking, well, I have and I have this and I have that, so I should be happy, but actually just being present, being fully aware of ourself, of our body, mind, and environment at this moment. There's contentment there. The Buddha said those who have contentment actually have freedom. So the Buddha in the later sections of the discourse just encourages us to be diligent, to apply these practices that he talked about, to be in a place where you can practice, to live in a place that's conducive to practicing. For lay folks, we can't just go to the monastery all the time. We live in the place that we live. We may live in a busy city, but we can, in a way, design our environment or choose an environment that's more conducive to mindfulness. We can make our home less chaotic. We can make our routine less chaotic, concentrated, and stable. We can create these conditions of practice as a layperson in our own homes. And the Buddha continues saying that if we do that, again, through precepts, concentration, we can have insight. He finishes saying by, if we have a truly stable mind and lifestyle, we can see how things are all impermanent. Anything that we have or we don't have, from our body to our ideas to our possessions, it's all impermanent. Nothing lasts. With that insight, our craving can drop away. Our aversion can drop away. Our rigid views about the world can drop away. And we'll experience what Buddhist wisdom is. Clear seeing of this changing nature of self and world, and a mind that doesn't cling to it. A mind that's always reflective, always aware, and careful not to crave, careful not to be hateful, careful not to be lost in views, lost in patterns. And the final teachings, he encourages practitioners again and again. He asks them, so after all of this, do you have any doubts? Do you have any questions? Nobody had questions. But another person spoke, encouraged everyone, and the Buddha finally said, hey, after saying all this, I'm done. That's it. I've said what needed to be said. You've heard what needed to be heard. All of you remember it. Share it with other people. You don't need me anymore, he said. You don't need me. It's not about me. He said, it's about you applying these teachings. It's about us applying these practices of daily discipline, stabilizing our mind through meditation and various practices, and always reflecting on ourselves, always reflecting. What are we doing with our mind? Are we hating? Are we craving? Are we arguing? Can we be compassionate? Can we see clearly and behave compassionately, skillfully? This, in general, is a summary of the Buddha's last teaching. I wasn't able to go over it in as much detail, but you can feel free to do a quick search online for the most versions are called the Buddha's bequeathed teachings. And Master Shengyan, my teacher, we have a publication, which you could find it on Amazon Kindle. I think it's a digital publication, and it's the Buddha's last teaching, the bequeathed teachings of the Buddha, which includes the original discourse, and it includes Master Shengyan's commentary, which is quite rich and insightful. So I'll finish here with the talk. I'd like to use some time. I think we have 15 minutes or so for either feedback. What did you think of the talk? Was it useful? Was it not? Open to constructive criticism, or questions. If you have any questions on how does this really apply to your life, you can feel free to text it in the bottom. Let's do that. Let's use text, just because sometimes talking can take much longer. So you could think about what you want to say and text it. And I'll take a look at the chats. I'll give you some time to work on that. Are you able to text, by the way? I think we turned off the chat earlier. You could raise your hand if you're not allowed to send the chat through, if it's not going through. Okay, it's working. So thank you, Kevin. Kevin says it was great. Okay, so it looks like Wei Shi is starting to share something here. He's talking about when he was depressed. There's a period when he was very depressed. He didn't care about anything. He didn't feel much happiness, much anger, or excitement. He says it didn't feel human.
Yeah, actually, it's my wife saying that.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. I mean, is it easier to just speak? Maybe speaking is okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Yeah. And after that period, and I recover from the depression, I feel a craving for something. And I think that's actually a better state of mind if I have normal craving for something that I want. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Compared to the depression, which is just like not caring about anything.
Yeah, I don't want anything and don't feel any interest on anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
pretty...
Yeah, I'd agree. Having some kind of desire or motivation to do something or to attain something, it's normal and it's healthy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So did you have a question, or you were just sharing your experience?
I have a question, because when I was in Beijing, I live in a very small apartment without any decoration or adornment. And I was very unhappy at that time because I think my life quality is very low. And then I grow a craving for to decorate my home to be better looking, and so that I can live more comfortably. So I start doing something. I contact the decoration company and they helped me to finish that. And after that, I really feel very happy. Yeah.
So I think our question is, you're talking about craving is bad, but she's saying craving is actually, well, craving served
It's
her,
positive.
served her very well.
I get it.
Hear your opinion on that.
I get it. Yeah. So you're saying craving here is actually a positive thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question or a good point. So when the Buddha talks about craving, or craving as being one of the sources of pain and suffering, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have any kind of desire or motivation to do something, like in your situation, to make your environment more pleasant, make your environment more comfortable, right? Motivation to do things that are healthy, a desire to do something healthy for ourselves, to take care of our body, to exercise, and even the desire to practice Buddhism, the desire to be happier, right? That's a desire. It's a motivation. So craving refers to this desire that becomes obsessiveness, endless wanting, feeling that things are not good enough, wanting more, and the mind not being able to be at peace because it's constantly wanting. So in that example, it's like, okay, if you decorated your house and it's like, oh, I feel good. But then a week later, it's like, it's still kind of boring. Can we like do something over here? Can we buy some more paintings, or let's do this? And then we finish that and it's like, oh, okay, I feel good. A couple weeks later, maybe we should move the couch over here. Maybe we should do this. If it turns out to be this endless process of never feeling content, that's what craving is referring to. The mind is always wanting and never satisfied. That's painful.
Yeah.
But a healthy desire to help us do something to improve our condition, it's not necessarily suffering. If it was, then why would the Buddha even want to share any of his insight with people?
I see your point.
Yeah, that's my perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I think other people have left some things in the chat. Okay, some folks just making comments. Someone's saying that Ewen saying meditation's getting boring. It's getting more and more boring. And it's like a routine. Just doing it, but it's really not much motivation to do it. And it can happen with other things. So boredom. Sounds like the main question here is boredom, yeah? This is also a great question or a great comment. Why do we get bored? I had this discussion with another client recently about their boredom with meditation, boredom with life. We came to the conclusion or observation that doesn't boredom often happen when we feel that everything is the same? Meditating today, meditating tomorrow, meditating the next day, blah, blah, blah. It's just meditating. It's the same every time. Or going to work. Have you folks ever felt just really bored with work? It's like just doing the same thing every day. Doing it over and over. It's the same. Does that happen? With boredom, it's like we have this idea that something is the same. And it feels like it. It feels there's no freshness to it anymore. Now, isn't it that we're seeing something as the same when actually it's very different? even sitting meditation, sitting in the same posture, on the same cushion, in the same space, it's actually really not the same. Our body is different every day. Our mental state, our physical state is different every day. Even the cushion, technically, the cushion changes shape the more we sit on it. Every day or every moment is different than the next. It's not the same. It's just our image of it or our idea of it is the same. What if we let go of the image or let go of the idea of something being the same and approach it as new every moment or every time? So whenever we sit to meditate, this is new. This is a new experience. Every time we go to work, in some way it's the same. In some way it's the similar location, similar situation, but it's actually not. It's also new. It's also fresh every day. If we have this kind of freshness, this attitude of freshness and newness, then we're not going to be bored. How could we be bored if we see that everything is new every moment? Kind of like when we do something for the first time. It's like, I've never done this before. It's so amazing. We're there. We're experiencing it fully. If we go back, let's say if it was like a vacation, we go back there again. It's the second time. It's like, yeah, I've been here before. Whatever. It's a nice beach. It's a beautiful place. Whatever. I've been here before. I've seen it. We lose all that kind of freshness and presence. And this goes along with the principle of impermanence, right? If everything changes, then actually everything, even if we watch the same movie again, even though the digital images are pretty much the same, we're a different person every time we see this movie, or every time we read this book, every time we meditate. So having this view of impermanence and practicing, approaching everything as fresh and new, boredom just doesn't take hold. How could it if everything is different? Those are my thoughts, at least.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Yuan. I don't think maybe we have time for one more. We still have a couple of minutes. Okay. This is an interesting question. Gina asking about craving as it relates to sexual misconduct or sexual craving. Usually sexual misconduct, this precept refers to not having sexual relationship outside of either a marriage or outside of an exclusive relationship if it's not agreed upon. Like the traditional view is like, yes, sex outside of the marriage, it's an affair, right? What if everybody agrees upon it? What if everyone's okay with it? The Buddha's definition of sexual misconduct accords with the situation in society. And as long as it doesn't create disharmony, it's not technically misconduct. As long as it doesn't lead to problems, it's not misconduct. So if a couple agrees upon sexual relationship with a third person, it's agreed upon, it's okay, that's not sexual misconduct. Everyone's harmonious, everyone's enjoying it. It's not technically creating disharmony. But the question here is, what about craving? And this is even, Gina's asking, what if you're just passionate about your partner? Is it fueling craving? And technically, yes, right? Unless we're having sex just to procreate, we're just doing it to have the child, It's sexual behavior is just for the feeling, isn't it? Or to enjoy it. There could be other reasons, just to please the other person. Maybe you have that kind of mindset. But that's interesting, and why monastics are celibate. Monastics don't have sexual behavior because for the most part, it's so easy to just crave and fuel craving. The more we have it, or the more we pursue it. But again, we're laypersons. For the average layperson, ordinary person who's not pursuing the monastic life, who's not pursuing celibacy, sex is normal. And yes, there's craving there, but can we do it in a way which doesn't become out of control? If it becomes a sexual addiction, if it does become having an affair when people don't agree upon having a third person or other people involved in the marriage or the exclusive relationship, if it creates disharmony, that's when our craving is getting out of control. So the bottom of Gina's question is, do I suggest having a more platonic relationship? No, not unless you guys agree upon it. Not unless the couple is interested in doing that, in not having sex for the sake of reducing craving. If that's what you find is helpful and you both agree upon that, then it's great. But I think disharmony can come when you have one person who's interested in that and the other person who's not. So if one person is a Buddhist and their partner isn't, that could be, and that person wants to be platonic, the partner doesn't, that could be creating a big conflict. So sexual behavior, whether it's with another person or with yourself, as a layperson, it's normal. But can we practice in a way so that our craving doesn't get out of control, doesn't create disharmony, either for ourselves or for others? That's the principle of sexual misconduct and just sexual behavior from the Buddhist perspective, as I understand it.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome. Yeah, I was actually thinking of having a talk about just sexuality from the Buddhist perspective. I mean, I rarely see anything about that, in Buddhist talks. Would you folks be interested in something like that? Feel free to nod your head or raise your hand if, how does Buddhism look at sex, sexuality, sexual relationships? Okay. Maybe that's a possible topic. Just to briefly look through the other comments. Thank you, everyone, for all your comments, for being here tonight. I appreciate you being here. Appreciate your feedback. If you have more feedback, feel free to find me on Facebook. Let me just also type in my email here. So if you want to reach out to me directly, I'd be happy to reply. Let me type it in. David@davidlisten.com. So how about we finish here for tonight? Thanks again, everyone. Wish you well and hope to see you soon.